You're listening to the Procuretech Podcast, your weekly show for all that's cooking in the digital procurement space. Yes, we've got the hottest startups, thought leadership, and conversation from visionary industry experts, and definitely no stiff corporate content. I'm your host, James Meads, Procurement Pro, Digital Nomad, and Procuretech fanboy. And now, here's this week's show. Yes, hello and welcome to another episode of the Procuretech Podcast, where every session we bring you everything that is fun and exciting in the digital procurement space. And this episode is actually the last in our mini-series talking to industry thought leaders, experts, and influencers on how digital procurement technology is impacting their little niche that they sit in the procurement world. And for this episode, we're going all the way to the other side of the world and going to Australia, where my guest today actually has his own procurement school. And his procurement school actually has a very noble mission, and that is to make procurement education more affordable to students who traditionally would not be able to afford some of the more established certifications that's out there. And I'm sure he's going to tell us a lot more about this as part of our interview. But first of all, I would like to extend a warm welcome to Nolan Menachemson from Nolan's School of Procurement. Welcome, Nolan.
Thank you so much, James. It's so lovely to be here with you on the Procuretech Podcast. Thank you so much. It's lovely for you to have me here. Thank you.
And I actually got to virtually meet some of your students back in April when I did a webinar as part of one of these procurement classes that you do. Just tell people a little bit about what it is, the mission, and what you aim to do, because I think the certification and what you're doing is, quite different to some of the more traditional methods and routes that people have traditionally gone down to get an education in this space.
Well, James, look, thank you so much. And I think basically, I do remember you speaking at our leadership course at the Nolan School of Procurement leadership course a few months ago, and you spoke very, very well. Thank you so much. James, I think my journey really began when I'll start off when I'd been working in procurement for about 15 years as a senior buyer, predominantly in the Australian government. And while the work was obviously a really engaging work and nicely paid, etc., and gave me a very strong sense of stability, it wasn't really touching my soul, James. When you can hear from my accent, I'm originally from South Africa. As a kid, I got quite involved in African social issues. This is back in the 1980s and 1990s, showing my age over here. And I was been trying to figure out for several years, James, how to synthesize and combine what I currently do in my career with community outreach. And one afternoon, I think it was one day, I was finishing work on a Friday and I was walking down the street, and it suddenly hit me that the way to combine community outreach and procurement would be to start my own school. And we've been in business now for approximately 3 years, just going on 3 years. And one of the values of my school, what I'm trying to tap into, is the fact that a lot of our students who are living in communities out in places like Africa and the Middle East, developing societies where people are either living too far at distance from an urbanized settlement where they can come in and get education. And also one of the other, barriers to entry is the price of traditional education, James. So I spotted that gap in the market, and that's how and why I got into, a procurement school.
And that's a very good reason for doing it, because, there are two things that you hit on, not just price, because, we know that some of these certifications are expensive, but as you say, just access to it. And, even in its simplest form with what you're doing webinars over Zoom, that's leveraging technology that 10 years ago wouldn't really have been possible. I know Skype was around 10 years ago, but it wasn't really reliable, and it was more really for one-on-one meetings rather than doing group webinars. And this has certainly grown and got better as as broadband's got better, but also as more competition has come out there on the market to be able to facilitate that. But I think if we do look at these sort of more emerging markets like, Africa and the Middle East or Latin America, for anyone that's maybe listening from the Spanish-speaking part of the world, one of the things that I think technology is going to have a big impact on there is that, a lot of business process outsourcing that has traditionally been done in some of these markets, the more entry-level positions are going to be automated in future. If you think of, how much of the procure-to-pay process or even how much of the sourcing process to a certain extent can be automated these days, and a lot of the number crunching around getting data and spend analytics too. So how does that impact your business? Obviously with the backdrop that the people that you're getting as students will probably not be classically educated in corporate compliance and ways of working than someone in a Western society might be. How do you then marry that against the backdrop of the fact that technology is impacting our profession at breakneck speed right now? And even though, the ones that have really embraced technology are still sort of the early adopters, most big companies now have to some extent done some digitization.
James, it's such an interesting question. And, it really goes back to a concept called the digital divide. And as we know, the divide between the haves and the have-nots, in other words, people living in affluent, developed countries, where people have access to good quality education, decent salaries, a high level standard of living, is vastly different from the world in which many of my students live, in places like, for example, Western and Central Africa and East Africa, and certain parts of the Middle East that are not particularly high-tech. They are facing very different challenges. Now, James, when I started the school, I had a really good look at the digital divide, and I asked myself, how am I going to figure out a way to close that gap for students that are facing, technological challenges that we living in the developed world can only, imagine. Things that we may take for granted. For example, having electricity in one's house, right? So some of my students, for example, before we even start, James, before we even start talking about emerging and cutting edge tech, we need to look at the basics. And many of my students that come into, for example, our Sunday webinars, because we run free webinars every Sunday, they have to put literally like a parking meter. They have to put money in the electricity box inside their apartment. Otherwise, they're not going to get light, electricity, and Wi-Fi, right? So, you sort of get a sense of how different is in the developing world. The other thing is the implications of technology on that world and on procurement. From a social procurement point of view, it's pretty profound. Firstly, a lot of people, as we said, have a problem with distance. People live all over Africa in places where often there isn't, there's no broadband in many of the urban and in the regional areas in Africa. There's no broadband. There isn't even wireless in some parts of the continent. So people are facing massive challenges just getting access to basic things like getting online and checking their email. So when I developed my school, one of the constraints that I had to think about was, students not having access to regular electricity, electricity shutting down, not having access to PCs. Most of these students are all their learning is happening from mobile phones. So there are huge constraints and huge challenges that I had to deal with in terms of technology. So for many of my students, of course, it's a very, very different world, James, from the kind of way that we utilize tech to push innovation and efficiency here in procurement in the developed world.
Yeah, and I want to touch on one specific point of your answer there, Nolan, and that's what you mentioned about smartphones, because I've read as well. I mean, I've been to South Africa. I've spent some time in Nigeria as well in the past. And one thing that I found was that you're absolutely right. People don't have PCs and they do absolutely everything on their smartphones. But with that being said, the speed of mobile internet there is actually pretty good. And I was speaking to a gentleman a few weeks ago, actually from Kenya, and he was saying that, there is, lightning fast internet via mobile in Kenya. So it's, yes, there are problems with blackouts in a lot of these countries and access to stable grid electricity, but the mobile network is often superior to that and certainly a lot cheaper than in many Western countries, right?
If I may comment on that, because I think you've raised a really good point over here. And James, I'll give you a good case study in just a few seconds. Papua New Guinea, which is obviously a country very close to where I live here in Australia, PNG, never really had a well-developed copper POTS, the plain old telephone system, never really had a good copper infrastructure. Certainly in the cities, in Port Moresby, in the capital, they had it, but up in the highlands, it was very challenging to get telephone services and by implication to get data services as well. So this is an example of a country that went straight to wireless technology, was adopted cheap mobile phone handsets, straight to 3G and 3G internet. And that is a good example. And that is what, as you said, has happened across a lot of Africa. Just using the country of Kenya as an example, in places like Nairobi in the capital, or in the smaller towns like Mombasa and Kisumu, obviously they have fiber out there and they have they still they've got lines out there. But when you get out into the countryside, it's really all wireless territory. So yes, it sort of seems to have skipped a generation of technology straight into wireless.
Hey, so just a quick interlude to let you know about procurementsoftware.site. This is a new website that I recently launched to give you, the listener, a free-to-access, intuitive guide to digital procurement technology. You can filter on a multitude of different criteria and pick out a short list of procurement software solutions that are relevant to your business and your needs in less time than it takes to boil an egg. No corporate subscriptions, no complex jargon, and definitely no pay-to-play model. We are a completely transparent, open book, and we really want to get your feedback on what we can really do to make this user experience better and constantly improve so as we're providing value to you. Check out procurementsoftware.site. And now let's get right back to this week's podcast. So if we assume that they're not going to skip back and develop and they're not all going to rush out and buy PCs and go down some of the older sort of more traditional routes of getting online. If we assume, and I think it's a reasonably fair assumption that, remote work or hybrid work is going to become a global phenomenon and people are going to more and more perform their work from home. When we look back at procurement technology, and let's take some of the more simple procurement technology like source to pay or e-sourcing technology, we're probably not going to see African public sector deploying, AI and machine learning in all areas of their operations. But if we take very basic procurement software, source to pay software, anything that wants to market to those countries, and it's a huge untapped market, it's going to have to be very easy, Amazon-esque, mobile friendly, isn't it?
Absolutely, James. I couldn't agree with you more. We're not going to see on-prem software. We're going to see everything as a service. We're going to see Internet of Things. We are going to see mobile technology moving forward and less reliance on large clunky hardware like PCs. And the implication, of course, on that is that people living at distance from an urban settlement will have an opportunity to become employed. Because in the past, obviously living in a village or in a rural or remote area was an economic death sentence. Today, if you've got wireless technology and you have a mobile phone, you can pretty much log into to whatever system you're using. And as long as the software allows, you could do some work from home. And that would obviously include online meetings. And as I said at the beginning earlier on in this talk, my school is based on the premise that we can reach students out there in rural areas. So this technology allows that to happen without the jump to mobile, without the prolific adoption of mobile. I would never have been able to reach all the students that I reach across the developing world.
So with that in mind, and then the other elephant in the room that I think about with some of these more emerging markets is corruption and fraud. Let's look at, how do you think technology will be able to positively impact companies or procurement teams in these markets that are struggling against stakeholder and internal corruption and fraud, but at the moment they don't have the means and the mechanisms to control that at large, other than doing manual investigations through individual instances?
James, I think one of the many ways in which the world has changed so phenomenally over the last few decades is the advent of digital technologies in combating things like corruption, fraud, probity issues, and the latest scourge, which is the talk of procurement these days, modern slavery. Now, limitations there, the limitations of the past, in my mind, included one, a lack of search functionality. We take things like Google, applications like Google, so for granted today. It's so easy for us to flip on a device in our home, a laptop, a tablet, a mobile phone. And if we need to know something, we just jump online onto Google or Bing or another search engine application, and it's spoon-fed to us with such ease. I remember a time where I needed to go to a library to get information, and that is just not the world anymore, right? So that's the one thing, the search functionality. The other thing is the enormous adoption of social media across the world, right? So there's nowhere to hide. Even in the most remote parts of the world, really, in terms of the reach of social media, there's nowhere to hide. And when one combines, the search functionality that is available by mobile phone to pretty much most people on the planet, combined with social media, that allows people to have the kind of capability to reach out and conduct work from remote locations and really conduct fairly in-depth deep dives into problems like corruption. Also, just the basic things like procurement policies and intranets, procurement policies and procurement processes being able to be stored online and accessed and retrieved remotely from having to go into a physical office, things like that. The digital age certainly has allowed people to reach out and to be able to do things like work from home. I think that's a really amazing capability, and that kind of tech. 15 years ago, it was largely non-existent.
Yeah, and social media is an interesting one, actually. I'll dig into that a little bit, because in the last series of the podcast, I actually interviewed a startup founder who, Prewave was the name of the company. They're from Austria. They have a tool that uses AI to essentially scrape and listen in on social media accounts and news sources in the native language that's been written about. So you mentioned modern slavery. That's a great example, or child labor. If there is a scandal in, let's say, a textile factory in Bangladesh, for example, or in a cobalt mine in the Congo, and that's been written about locally on social media channels or in local newspapers, a compliance department or an investigative department of a large corporate probably wouldn't be aware of that until the proverbial hits the fan and it gets reported on in the Western media. But if technology can scour local news sources and pick up on that faster, it also allows that brand or that company to have a lot more protection around their name, that they're not going to get embroiled in these scandals, or if they do, that they acknowledge them and get out of them pretty quickly.
Absolutely, James. It's kind of like there are three elements in combating scourges like corruption and modern slavery in the modern era. The one thing, we need three things. The first thing is a mobile device. The second thing is an application, a search functionality application. And the third is social media. When you combine these three things together, you put a lot of power into the hands of what we might call ordinary people. Now, James, just briefly, you mentioned modern slavery, and, there are some really cutting-edge, fabulous tools out there in terms of combating modern slavery. And one of the unfortunate things in this world that you mentioned was cobalt mining, where we have millions of children involved in digging in very dangerous conditions for cobalt when they should be, at school getting a formative education. But the great thing about technology is that it doesn't only require the absolute cutting edge. So, for example, in Australian government, in the UK government, and other governments around the world, we are seeing not necessarily only cutting edge anti-modern slavery tools and mechanisms and instruments, but also some simple things that people can adopt when they don't have access to a lot of high-tech equipment back at home, right? So, for example, having an ethical supplier questionnaire in their tenders and having conditions about, modern slavery, relating to modern slavery in the tender documents, in the contract documents. These things are all digital, and these will go a long way to helping eradicate modern slavery. So it's not always, cutting edge AI. But just some simple mechanisms and tools that can be used in the digital space. And I think that's fabulous because, not everyone will have access, and certainly not all governments and large corporates in the developing world will have access to that kind of software.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you touch on a raw nerve for me as well, that it's not necessarily about how many features a piece of technology has. It's about what problem does it solve and how easy is it to use and to implement. And if you've got, an easy to use tool that can be implemented within a couple of days and is able to solve a lot of pain points or challenges that an organization hitherto wasn't able to fix, then, it's a no-brainer, isn't it? In terms of, return on investment through both the productivity and the cost saving or cost avoidance that it could deliver. Yeah. So, The last thing that I wanted to ask you, Nolan, was to what extent do you think technology is going to be the driver in elevating our profession? Especially if we take it in your view of the world, speaking to a lot of buyers and purchasing managers within emerging markets. How much do you think tech is going to be a driver behind this? Will it even, prevent them from seeking emigration because they can now work remotely? I think that's also a really important factor.
James, that's a rather interesting question. When I think about drivers and outcomes, those outcomes, traditionally when we talk about the outcomes of drivers used in procurement, we're looking at outcomes like efficiency, cost avoidance and systems. But as this talk has touched on the social nature, the social aspects of procurement, and as we become, more conscious and more aware of our global impact as procurement people, we should be thinking about outcomes to do with social procurement, right? Because look, obviously there's new tech, there's new software every day, new procure to pay applications out there that are creating wonderful efficiencies and, bringing lean manufacturing to places where traditionally that would never have existed. As we said, cost avoidance and better systems. But one of the things that we don't really look at enough, in my opinion, it's where our grace is, James. It's where we as procurement people find grace, because we're not just all about cost avoidance. It's about social and making the world a better place, and particularly in reference to things like, we mentioned modern slavery. This is where we can actually take procurement, the digital side of procurement. We can use it to employ people who otherwise would be living, a very poor life in a rural or remote village. It's a way of educating people out in the sticks, who perhaps travel very far every day to get back from, to and from work, and may not have the levels of energy to go and study, in a full-time urban environment after work. It's also, and it's also, of course, in terms of social procurement, it's an opportunity to get companies to think about their policies and think about, for example, do they have a domestic violence policy at work? Do they have, social procurement in their policies in the organization to stimulate and uplift small businesses and that type of thing? So I think that one of the great drivers over here, is pushing towards social procurement. That's what I think.
And there's certainly a ton of platforms and software that are coming on the market now that tackle all different various aspects of ESG, whether that's, sustainability, whether it's, like you say, governance around modern slavery and eradicating some of the issues in supply chains that have historically been, very difficult to track and trace. It's a mushrooming market in terms of the tech that's available. That's for sure. Nolan, final question. If anyone would like to learn more about what you're doing with your school or would perhaps like to connect with you, where's the best place that they can reach out?
Thanks, James. Well, look, we have a website that we are constantly updating, nolanschoolofprocurement.com. And if you go to the website, you can register with our school, and then, of course, you will receive notifications about our free webinars that we run every Sunday. We call them Sunday Serious Skills webinars, and that takes place Australia time, East Coast time, 9 p.m. In the UK, it would probably be around noon, 12 p.m. And we are a fully online school, in the spirit of what we've been saying about reaching people in remote areas. So no matter where you live in the world, we are able to bring you into our webinars, and you can enjoy very low-cost education through our school.
And that, I think, is a very noble cause. Nolan, thank you so much for taking time to come and talk to me today. Appreciate what you're doing. Keep doing what you're doing. I think it really adds value to others that may otherwise not have been able to reach that level of education in their profession. So good luck to you in the future, and I hope it all goes well and continues to grow.
Lovely to speak to you again, James. Thank you so much.
And that concludes Series 3 of the Procuretech Podcast. Thank you so much for being with us on the journey. We appreciate all of our listeners. If you did like this episode or indeed this series, then don't forget to subscribe to the podcast in your favorite podcast player. We'll be back again in a few weeks' time with Series 4. Keep an eye out for that on our LinkedIn page or in our newsletter. We'll be sharing more details with that very, very soon. Until then, take care wherever you are in the world. Look after yourselves. See you soon, and bye for now.